What if the simplest phrase you use in English is actually creating awkward moments you're not even aware of? What if just saying hello feels easy, but using it the way native speakers do is kind of a hidden cultural puzzle? Welcome to Daily English Practice. Listen and speak. This is host speaker.
And I'm expert speaker. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something that seems incredibly fundamental, but as we'll find out, it has surprising layers of challenge and, well, nuance. English for meeting new people.
Yeah, our mission in this deep dive is really to pull back the curtain on what the sources are telling us about the psychology of making connections, maybe the surprising linguistics behind simple hellos, and, the most practical ways to actually put it all into practice. It's all aimed at helping you feel more confident, more effective
Yeah.
the next time you introduce yourself or strike up a conversation in English.
Exactly, and we've gathered insights from a few different angles. We looked at some research touching on why initiating conversations can feel so, well, difficult. Then there's a really fascinating linguistic study that compared English and Chinese greeting practices, which we'll get into. And finally, some practical advice on how you can leverage social opportunities for language learning.
Okay, so let's dive right into that first hurdle then. Because if you're learning English, you've almost certainly felt it right. That knot in your stomach before you have to talk to someone new, that feeling of being maybe intimidated, overthinking every single word before it comes out, the worry about making a bad impression. It's a really, really common experience.
It absolutely is, and the sources help explain some of the psychology behind that. I mean, making connections with people is incredibly fulfilling, right? We're social creatures, but initiating those connections, that first step, that can feel genuinely daunting for almost anyone, regardless of language.
Why is that, though? Why is the starting part so hard?
Well, one piece of the puzzle seems to be our own internal focus. Humans have this really strong tendency to talk about themselves. One source mentions studies showing we spend anywhere from 30 to 40% of our everyday speech doing just that.
Wow, 30 to 40%. That feels surprisingly high.
It does, doesn't it? And when you're meeting someone new, that internal focus can be a barrier. You're perhaps more focused on how you sound, what you should say next, whether you are making mistakes,
Right.
rather than genuinely focusing on the other person.
Right. You're sort of stuck in your own head running this internal monologue of worry.
Exactly. And it's often compounded by another psychological finding. People tend to be quite pessimistic about how strangers will react to them. They often anticipate disinterest or even rejection, which creates these perceived social risks. You kind of build a mental wall based on an imagined negative outcome before the conversation even begins.
Okay, now, as if that wasn't enough, let's layer learning a new language like English on top of all that sort of natural human anxiety. Suddenly, you're not just worried if they'll like you, but you're also stressing about your pronunciation, scrambling for the right vocabulary, trying to remember grammar rules on the spot. It just adds a whole extra dimension of potential perceived failure.
It really creates a perfect storm for that feeling of, wanting to connect but being sort of frozen by fear. And this challenge starts right at the very first moment you interact.
Which brings us to something that sounds incredibly simple. But the sources reveal it has this surprising complexity.
Exactly. How can something as basic as saying hello or hi be a source of puzzlement? It seems so straightforward, but as we'll dig into, even the fundamental act of greeting someone can be culturally loaded and function differently than you might expect.
Okay, so knowing we tend to get stuck in our own heads, and knowing that initiating feels risky, what did the sources offer as a powerful tool? Something to break through that internal barrier and connect with someone new.
Well, it's deceptively simple. Asking thoughtful questions.
It feels almost too easy, doesn't it? Like, just ask a question.
But the sources make a really strong case for why it works so well. When you ask a question, especially an open-ended one, you immediately shift the focus away from yourself and onto the other person. It demonstrates curiosity, it shows you're actively listening, and it makes you appear more personable and approachable. People generally appreciate it when you show genuine interest in them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It takes the pressure off needing to perform or entertain and puts the spotlight on, learning about the other person.
Precisely. And practically speaking, asking questions helps you navigate those awkward silences that can sometimes pop up when you're meeting someone new. It gives the other person something specific to respond to, which keeps the conversation flowing.
And it's probably the quickest way to find common ground, isn't it? You ask about their interests, their background, their day, and suddenly you find something you both connect over.
Absolutely. Finding that shared interest is key, as the source points out, because it allows the conversation to move beyond just surface level small talk and potentially develop into something more meaningful. Asking questions is really the engine that drives that discovery.
Okay, let's talk about putting this into practice then. The sources provide examples of different types of questions, suggesting you tailor them a bit to the situation. What kind of questions work best when you're just, starting out?
Right. For those initial moments, you probably want lighter icebreaker questions. These are usually easy to answer and don't require too much personal detail right up front. Think things like, how do you usually spend your weekends? Or maybe, what kind of music have you been listening to lately? Or even something simple like, have you seen any good movies recently? They're pretty low pressure, but they open the door.
Right, like testing the waters. Makes sense. What about questions that are a bit more versatile, maybe after the very first minute or so?
Yeah, then you can maybe move to slightly more expansive questions that work in lots of settings. Things like, what's something you're looking forward to this week? Or, if you could travel anywhere right now, where would you go?
Yeah.
These are still approachable, but they invite a slightly more detailed response than a simple icebreaker. They help you learn a bit more about the person's aspirations or preferences, perhaps.
And what if the conversation is actually going well and you feel a connection starting to form? Can you go deeper?
Yes, that's when you might consider more personal questions, but only if the setting and the relationship feel appropriate. The source really emphasizes reading the room here. You probably wouldn't ask these right away at a formal networking event, but maybe at a casual gathering or after you've been talking for a little while. Examples could include things like, what was something you were really passionate about when you were younger? Or maybe, is there a particular book or movie that really influenced you? These kinds of questions can lead to deeper discussions and reveal more about someone's core values or experiences.
It makes sense you sort of build up to that level of depth. And I liked the idea in the source about having some fun questions in your back pocket, too.
Oh, definitely. Fun questions can inject energy and personality into the conversation. Things like, what's the most unusual thing you've ever eaten? Or, if you woke up tomorrow with a brand new skill, what would you want it to be? They're lighthearted and can lead to some pretty memorable
The
moments.
key, though, as you said earlier, is keeping them open-ended, right? Avoid the, do you like pizza? And go for what's your favorite kind of food?
Exactly. You want to encourage them to talk, to share a bit, not just give a one-word answer. And of course, while asking questions is powerful, it's really crucial to remember it's a conversation, not an interrogation.
Good point.
Be ready to share about yourself in response, too. It has to be a two-way exchange to feel natural.
Okay, so we've talked about the anxiety of starting and how asking questions can really help you connect. But before you even get to asking, how do you spend your free time? Vic, you have to actually start the interaction. And this is where one of the sources revealed something really unexpected, I thought, about English.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how different cultures handle that very first moment, the greeting itself. The linguistic study we looked at, comparing English and Chinese greetings, highlighted some surprisingly deep differences in, well, function and usage.
You'd think hi is just hi, right? Pretty universal.
Well, it feels that way because it's so common in English, perhaps.
Hmm.
The study found that English greetings like hi, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening are used with remarkable frequency, like almost constantly. For the British speakers in that particular study, using a greet expression was almost compulsory in pretty much all scenarios where they encountered someone they recognized.
All scenarios, really.
Yeah.
Like formal, informal, close friend, or just an acquaintance.
Yes, the study found that factors like whether the setting was private or public, or the social distance or power dynamic between the speakers, none of that seemed to matter much for whether a greet was used by the English speakers. Simply recognizing the other person seemed to almost automatically trigger a need to use a greeting.
Okay, wow. So English speakers basically greet everyone they recognize everywhere. How does that compare to the findings for Chinese speakers?
This is where the contrast is really striking. For the Chinese speakers in the study, using a formal greeting was not seen as compulsory in all situations, particularly in less formal or close relationships. The relationship itself seemed more important than the setting in determining whether a formal greeting was needed.
So hang on, in situations where an English speaker would feel almost obligated to say hello, a Chinese speaker might do something else entirely.
Exactly. The study noted that instead of a conventional greeting, Chinese speakers in those types of situations might use other forms of interaction to initiate. For example, they might use a remark like saying, oh, you're here already, or even a request like, is person's name in? Formal greetings, things like ni hao, nin hao, or using a title followed by hao, were more specifically reserved for situations involving a clear power difference or greater social distance.
That's a really significant difference right at the start, at the sort of handshake moment of the conversation.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the greeting is different too, isn't that what the study suggested?
It is, yeah. In English, the study found that greetings typically serve to keep the interaction in what they called the opening phase. It's kind of a ritualistic acknowledgement of the other person's presence. Phrases like, how are you, often fall into this opening phase too. You're not necessarily expecting a detailed medical report in response.
Right, right. How are you?
Yeah.
Is often just part of the greeting ritual itself, like saying hello again.
Precisely. It signals, okay, we are now acknowledging each other and opening communication before you move on to the main topic or the business phase of the conversation. However, in Chinese, the study found that greetings, particularly the more formal ones, or maybe when combined with other communication types like a tell, which is stating information, can actually move the interaction directly into that business phase.
Hmm. Can you give an example of that, how it moves things along faster?
Well, the example that's often cited is the phrase, have you eaten already? In certain contexts in Chinese, this can serve a similar ritualistic function to an English greeting, acknowledging the other person and opening communication. But the linguistic study technically classifies it as a different type of speech act, a phatic expression, which is basically a phrase used for social connection and ritual rather than to exchange literal information. The point is, it can transition much more quickly to the actual purpose of the interaction.
Okay, so what does this all mean for someone learning English? Especially if maybe their first language handles greetings differently, perhaps more like the Chinese examples in that study.
Well, it means that the sheer ubiquity of English greetings, the fact that you seem to need to use them with almost everyone you recognize in almost every situation, combined with their specific function of keeping the conversation in that often quite drawn-out opening phase, well, that can be genuinely confusing. It might feel unnecessary, maybe overly formal, or perhaps like you're wasting time before getting to the real point compared to how interactions might typically start in their native culture. It's a subtle, often unconscious cultural rule embedded in the simplest words.
Wow, that is really insightful. Okay, so we've acknowledged the challenges like anxiety and, getting stuck in our heads. We've armed ourselves with the tool of asking good questions. And now we understand this unexpected cultural nuance around greetings. How do you actually take all of this and get better at meeting people in English? What's the practical step?
Yeah, as with so many things in language learning, the most effective solution boils down to practice, consistent practice. And the sources strongly point to one of the best environments for this, actually attending social events with English speakers.
Okay, I can immediately see why that would be beneficial. It's applying everything we've just talked about,
Uh,
but in a real-world setting, right?
Exactly. And the benefits for your language learning are numerous. First, it's just fantastic for practicing conversation. You're in an informal, relaxed setting, which is miles away from a typical classroom environment. This is where you can actually use and refine your pronunciation, your vocabulary, your grammar, and even pick up idiomatic expressions more naturally. It helps build fluency and that much-needed confidence in sort of low-stakes interactions. This directly tackles the anxiety we discussed earlier.
It's not just about the words themselves, is it? It's more than that.
No, absolutely. And crucially, for addressing that greeting puzzle we talked about, you also learn culture. By immersing yourself in social events, you start to pick up on customs, traditions, body language, and yes, those vital cultural nuances, like precisely how greetings are used in different situations, the typical flow of small talk, how people transition to deeper topics, all in real conversations. Seeing and hearing it happen is so different from just reading about it.
That really connects back to that surprising finding about greetings. You get to see the function in action.
Precisely. And beyond language and culture, there are often networking opportunities too. Social events where you meet diverse people, you can make new friends, hear different perspectives, and, if you have professional goals, you might even encounter specific vocabulary or make valuable connections.
That makes sense. And it's also invaluable for improving listening skills, I imagine.
Definitely. Different people have different accents, different speeds of talking, different styles of speaking. Social events expose your ear to all this variety, usually in a comfortable setting, which significantly boosts your comprehension skills over time.
And perhaps most importantly, it helps you overcome shyness and build confidence. Social environments, especially ones that are maybe welcoming or even geared towards learners, can provide a safer space to take risks with your English.
Every successful interaction, even a brief one initiated with just a simple greeting and a question, builds your self-esteem. Practice genuinely makes you more comfortable with the uncomfortable. It really does.
And let's not forget, you actually get to have fun. Language learning shouldn't feel like a chore all the time. Social events are where you can genuinely enjoy using English, make friends, share stories, and connect with people on a human level. Plus, nonverbal cues like smiles and gestures play a huge role in bridging communication gaps when the words aren't quite perfect yet.
Absolutely. And for managing that initial anxiety before you even step into a social event, the sources offered some really practical tips too. Things like preparing beforehand, maybe thinking of a few icebreaker questions or topics you could bring up, mentally rehearsing potential simple interactions, using breathing exercises to calm your nerves right before, positive visualization, picturing the interaction going well, mindfulness techniques to stay present in the moment, starting small with lower pressure interactions if a big event feels like too much at first, and critically, reflecting on your successes afterwards, however small, and practicing self-compassion if an interaction doesn't go exactly perfectly. These tools can make a really big difference in getting you to the point where you feel ready to jump in and practice.
So, okay, wrapping this deep dive up, we've really unpacked the different layers of meeting new people in English. We've seen that the difficulty isn't just about knowing the language, the words, and grammar, but also about navigating those psychological barriers like anxiety and self-focus, and understanding potentially hidden cultural rules embedded even in simple things like saying hello.
Mm-hmm. And asking thoughtful questions really stands out as a powerful, actionable tool. It helps shift the focus outwards, manage your own nerves, and genuinely build connections by showing curiosity and finding that common ground.
And those simple English greetings, well, they're used much more widely, much more ubiquitously than learners from certain backgrounds might expect. And they primarily serve that ritualistic function of keeping the conversation in the opening phase. Understanding that surprising nuance can really demystify those first few seconds of interaction.
And the best way to integrate all these insights to make them second nature is through real-world practice. Social events offer such a rich environment to do just that, to build fluency, learn cultural cues firsthand, improve your listening, and really boost your confidence step by step.
Remember, every meaningful connection you make often starts with these small interactions, a greeting, a first question, just a willingness to engage. Don't let that initial awkwardness deter you. It's actually a really natural part of the process. It's a sign that you're pushing past your comfort zone, and that's exactly where real learning and growth happen.
Practice really is what turns theory into comfortable confidence. There's no substitute.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Consider how much richer your English learning journey and potentially your life overall could be simply by embracing that slightly uncomfortable moment of saying hello and following it up with a genuine question, just being curious about the person in front of you.
Yeah, we really encourage you to try putting some of these ideas into practice this week. Maybe look for just one opportunity to initiate a simple interaction using one of the question types we discussed. See how it feels.